time to shift back into the world of retro handhelds and check out the latest offering from Powkiddy. The RGB30 is definitely a unique looking device equipped with a perfectly square 1:1 ratio display that, despite its unusual aspect ratio, can potentially be a perfect match for emulating some well-loved handhelds. For Powkiddy, this is not unexplored territory, as they have used the Rockchip RK3566 SoC in prior devices this year, and as such, we will be exploring the potential of the RGB30 in a different way. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we examine all of the capabilities of the RGB30 and see if this is an option that, despite its unique aspects, is worth considering. So, as we always do, let's get some specs on this device and learn more about it. The RGB30 is equipped with a very unique 4-inch 1:1 aspect ratio OCA laminated IPS display with a 720 by 720 resolution. It's powered by the Rockchip RK3566, which, as I mentioned in my intro, Powkiddy is no stranger to this chipset. It has 1GB of LPDDR4 RAM. There are 2 microSD slots available on the RGB30. The first slot is used to store the operating system, and all versions of the RGB30 come with a 16GB microSD with the OS loaded on it. There are options to purchase the RGB30 with the expansion card that comes preloaded with games. Alternatively, you can provide your own microSD card for storage expansion, which is the approach I recommend taking. The RGB30 supports Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and USB-C for charging and data, as well as video out with the mini HDMI port and a 3.5mm headset port. It features a 4100 mAh battery that Powkiddy claims has an average of 8 hours of battery life with a 2-hour charging time. The RGB30 comes with JELOS out of the box and is available now for shipping in blue, black, white, and more recently yellow and red colorways. This specific unit was sent to me by the folks at LitNXT for the purposes of this review, and as always, they did not review this video prior to publishing. They are having a Halloween sale, and the RGB30 is included in the sale right now, which brings the device to around $80 shipped. Okay, with the specs out of the way, let's unbox this RGB30 and check out what Powkiddy includes here. Taking a look around the box, and this is very much a standard Powkiddy package that is simple with only a few markings indicating the model number and then the configuration inside the box. As the package shows, we have the option for black, white, and blue, and the model I received here is the blue variant. Powkiddy now offers the RGB30 in yellow and red. Alright, let's get this cover off and reveal what's inside. As always, Powkiddy provides us with a foamy insert to protect the handheld. Let's get the RGB30 out of here for a moment and check out what else we have. Okay, let's remove the plastic insert that holds the device, and now below that we have the included USB Type-C to Type-C cable. Pretty standard stuff by now, and it's not a particularly long length. Finally, at the bottom we have the small instruction sheet, which is actually pretty useful as it does detail some important commands and shortcuts. Okay, back to the RGB30 now, and let's get the protective baggie off so we can reveal the RGB30 and check out how it looks. Always make sure to take the time to unbag with care. Say hello to the Powkiddy RGB30, and definitely a little unusual at first to hold in the hands because of its squarish shape. So with the RGB30 out of its bag, let's go ahead and take a tour around the handheld and check out what we have on the device. Let's start out at the top right, and for this device, Powkiddy is going with the inline shoulder buttons to help keep a slim profile for the RGB30. These are pressing down well for both the R1 and R2, and you can probably hear the clickiness of the button action. I don't have any issues pressing down across the entirety of the R1 button, and so far seems to have no issues, and these don't have much travel. You can see that the R2 button is slightly raised, so it makes it easier to feel and reach when holding the device. Now moving along the top of the handheld, we have the power and reset buttons. Next to that, we have the mini HDMI out for displaying to a TV or monitor, and then beside that we have the volume up and down buttons. Finally, we have the left side shoulder buttons, which are pressing down in a similar way as the ones on the right. Again, no issues here pressing down on them. Going down the left side, there is nothing to note except for this interesting texture on the sides that almost gives the RGB30 a mini ROG Ally vibes, especially in the other colors. At the bottom of the unit, we have a bit more to talk about here, with the USB Type-C port on the left, the micro SD slot with the included 16GB card that comes preloaded with JELOS. In the middle, we have the 3.5mm headset port, and beside that on the right, we have the additional micro SD slot for game storage. My unit in particular included a 128GB game card. Finally, we have an additional OTG USB Type-C port. Now moving up the right side, we have the same texturing as found on the left side. On the back of the RGB30, we have absolutely no markings, which is definitely unusual for a Powkiddy device. The only thing here on the back are the 4 screws to remove the back cover. So let's go front side and talk about the controls. At the top, we have the clicky select button, and then below that we have a nice membrane-based directional pad. Powkiddy has been doing a pretty decent job lately with their D-pads, and this one already feels like it will be fairly solid. I like the pivot of this one at the center, as well as the travel from side to side. Movement overall seems to be pretty good here, but we will be testing this in just a little bit. Below the D-pad, we have the standard Switch style analog stick. Movement is smooth, and here's a side profile of how the sticks sit above the face of the device. Right below that, we have one of the stereo speakers, which are obviously front firing and very nice to see. Okay, now on the right side, we have the clicky start button at the top. Below that, we have the 4 face buttons set up in the Nintendo BA-YX style configuration. Face buttons is another area that Powkiddy has been doing a pretty good job with this year. These are membrane based and really have what I consider just the right amount of travel and response for a face button. These are definitely satisfying to press down on, and as you can see from the side, also sit above the unit properly. I think these are another winner for Powkiddy, and I'm definitely happy with the trend. These remind me very much of the RK2023 buttons. Below the face buttons, we have the right analog stick, and then finally the other front-firing stereo speaker. So with our tour out of the way, it's time to power on the RGB30 for the first time and see what awaits us. With the power turned on, we are first greeted with the JELOS boot screen, and one thing I wanted to check here was how long that initial boot time was, and I can say that this is exactly what I expect from JELOS, and we came in at under 25 seconds, which is what I expect to see here. Welcome to the main screen of the RGB30, and if you end up with a preloaded microSD card, you can expect to see something similar to this. Now I have the 128GB version, and so there's a lot of stuff preloaded on here. Let's quickly run through each platform available and some of the games on hand here for reference. Again, this is what to expect with the 128GB model, so expect less games with the 64GB version or more games with the 256GB version. So now I think it's the perfect time to discuss the build quality of the Powkiddy RGB30. I have to say it's a device that doesn't actually look or feel as cheap as one might expect, especially from a Powkiddy product. There's no obvious flexing in my bend test, and it's surprisingly finished a lot better than I expected. The device definitely has some rattling when shaking it because of these shoulder buttons. The plastic is nice feeling, and while it does pick up some fingerprints, I am holding the device directly to a bright light, and I've also not wiped it down at all in about 2 weeks, so this is not that bad. And also, I think if you are really concerned about this, the white or even the lighter colors coming out will be a good option. Regardless, the plastics do feel nice overall. In fact, I like this more than the RK2023, which I am quite fond of, but I did feel it was a little bit cheap, and even more so when compared to the RGB30. Now let's talk about the display, and really, what can I say except that it is just fantastic. This is a sharp and bright, high-resolution display at 720 by 720, and of course, very unique in the space. And regardless of which way I hold the RGB30, I've had no issues with the images washing out. I really can't overstate enough just how great this display looks in person, and it has really made my Game Boy, Gameboy Color, and PICO-8 games stand out, showing off pixels with great sharpness and clarity. The display, despite being seen as an odd choice by some, is actually the thing I love the most about this RGB30. And another solid design choice here is the front-firing stereo speakers, which definitely get pretty loud at its highest volume setting. Not only that, but it didn't matter which way I held the device, as my hands never obstructed the speaker grills, and so its placement and the fact that it's front-firing makes this a joy to listen to. Here's a sample of the intro to Tobu Tobu Girl Deluxe, which is a personal favorite Game Boy Color game of mine. Finally, I had to hop into some Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for Sega Dreamcast to do my usual fighting game test with the D-pad, and the RGB30 can have an overly sensitive D-pad at times, which is why if you are very sensitive to that or do not want false diagonals, you will want to do the tape mod on the contact pads. My friend Shem over at RetroBreeze has done a great job covering this. However, in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, the D-pad is doing exactly what I wanted to do, and I'm having no real issues pulling off combos and moving all over the place on the screen. So let's now go ahead and size up the RGB30 to some other handhelds in this space. You've probably noticed on screen that I've got a wide assortment of devices here that will be joining us for these comparisons. Naturally, we will start out with our main attraction, and let's get the weight of the RGB30, which comes in at 203 grams or a little over 7 ounces. Next up, we have another Powkiddy device, the RK2023, which released earlier this year. I am quite fond of this device. It's cheap, compact, and is a comfortable device that is priced right. It also shares a lot of similarities with the RGB30, and so it is a good comparison device. The RK2023 is a little bit lighter, coming in at a little over 6 ounces or 173 grams, but it does have a smaller 3.5-inch 4:3 screen. Here's the Retroid Pocket 2S, which shares a similar horizontal format and size. However, the Retroid Pocket 2S is a bit more expensive. Regardless, I do think it's interesting to compare here. The Pocket 2S comes in at 196 grams or just shy of 7 ounces, making it very similar to the RGB30 in terms of weight. And here is an Ambernic device with that horizontal format and the same RK3566 as the RGB30, which makes it a perfect device to compare to. The RG353PS comes in at 7.5 ounces or 213 grams and is priced similar to the RGB30, but does have a smaller 3.5-inch screen that is in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Now for fun, I wanted to bring in some of the oldies for this, since you will find out in a little bit that I actually adore the RGB30 for these specific platforms. Here's my original Game Boy with batteries and a cart loaded up in there, and this chonker comes in at 351 grams or about 12.5 ounces. Next is my really cool looking Game Boy Pocket in green, loaded up with some batteries and a cart, and this one comes in at 162 grams or a little under 6 ounces. And then the Game Boy Color, which comes in at a little over 7.5 ounces or 216 grams. And finally, the absolutely massive and beastly Game Gear, which is loaded up with its 6 AA batteries and a cartridge. This beauty comes in at over 1 pound or 508 grams and definitely makes you appreciate what we have today. Now let's compare the sizes of the RGB30 to these handhelds I've shown off so far. First up, we have all of the horizontal format handhelds that I believe are decent comparisons to the RGB30 in terms of size, power, and price. From left to right, we have the Ambernic RG353PS, Retroid Pocket 2S, the RGB30, and the Powkiddy RK2023. It's quite apparent that despite the large 4-inch 1:1 screen, we are getting a really awesome screen-to-body ratio here with the RGB30, especially compared to the other handhelds on screen. The RGB30 still manages to remain pretty compact overall. I wanted to quickly show off the vertical format handhelds compared to the RGB30, and going from left to right we have the Miyoo Mini Plus, Ambernic RG35XX, the RGB30, and then finally the TikTok darling, the Powkiddy RGB20S, which I actually recently looked at on the channel. Again, this is a selection that I felt aligns in many ways with the RGB30 in terms of power, price, and size. The RGB30 is definitely larger than this selection of handhelds. Finally, let's compare the RGB30 to all the classics with the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Pocket, and original Game Boy. The RGB30 is not only smaller than the original Game Boy, but it's also much thinner, which brings us to this great overhead shot of the horizontal handhelds, and somehow the Game Gear made its way into this shot thinking it could win out in terms of thinness. The RGB30, as I mentioned earlier in the video, maintains a very thin profile, especially with those inline shoulder buttons. But just for the sake of accuracy, let's actually measure the thickness of the devices here. The RGB30 comes in at a little over 17.5mm, with the Retroid Pocket 2S coming in at a little over 16mm, and the RG353PS, which is a bit thicker, coming in at a little over 22mm. Finally, the RK2023, which is nearly identical in thickness to the RGB30 at that 17.5mm size. And one last thing I wanted to do here is measure up the face buttons and analog stick cap. The analog stick cap is about 14.5mm, which is pretty standard for these Switch style sticks. The face buttons measure in at about 7.9mm, and I suspect that the face buttons on the RGB30 are similar in size to the ones on the RK2023, so let me quickly grab the RK2023 and compare here, and as I suspected, these are identical in size. I really do like the size of these face buttons, which are actually larger than usually found on these retro handheld devices, such as the Retroid Pocket 2S here, which comes in at about 7mm, and even the Anbernic RG353PS, which comes in at about 7.5mm. So enough of all that measuring, let's actually get under the hood and tear down the RGB30 to see what's going on here. As always, I'll grab my trusty iFixit-Kit, and we will start with the Phillips head bit size 1 to remove the 4 screws that are on the back. Let's quickly get these screws out of here and then pry this back cover off. I recommend starting at the L2 or R2 area so that you can get a tool to wedge in there and force a bit of separation. The back cover is held into place really tight, and so you will need a good amount of force to be able to remove the back cover. At the same time, you will need to be careful because when separating that back cover, there is a lot going on under the hood here. You will see that multiple wires are attached to the back cover, including both the left and right speaker cables, the Wi-Fi antenna, and the connector for the battery. Take care to not pull the back cover off immediately knowing all of this. Okay, let's disconnect the speaker cables, Wi-Fi antenna, and battery cable, and now we can take a closer look at this back cover, which has the 4100 mAh battery attached to it. I do appreciate that the battery is easily accessible and can be replaced without much effort if needed in the future. Here we've also got both speakers attached to this back cover. Not only that, but we have the part of the Wi-Fi antenna just taped on here, which isn't the most secure thing, but at least this time we get Wi-Fi out of the box, which is something that Powkiddy has been forgoing initially with a lot of their recent devices. So with that back cover off, I wanted to show these shoulder buttons, which actually have a bit of felt material on them to help dampen the loudness from the presses. This is nice to see and definitely shows that Powkiddy thought about this issue, since it was noticeable in other devices like the X55, which had noisier button presses. Let's get a nice centered shot of the mainboard with that back cover off. We can see the Rockchip RK3566 on display right in the center. Something that is immediately noticeable is the ease of access for those analog sticks, which are not buried under any other boards and have direct access once disconnected. This will make swapping out sticks a very simple job here. Alright, let's take out the micro SD cards and then continue to tear down the device by removing the 8 additional screws that secure the mainboard to the shell. You can continue to use the same Phillips head size 1-bit to remove these additional screws. Let's quickly get these screws removed so that we can get access to the mainboard and free it from the shell. With all of the screws out of the way, we can now easily lift the mainboard out and take a closer look. Now with this device, a lot of community members have been doing the D-pad tape mod, and so this is a good example of what is needed to gain access to the contact pads on the mainboard in order to apply that tape fix, which will help prevent false diagonals. Here's a closer look at the membrane from the side and how it presses down. Again, as I mentioned, I really like this membrane. It's got a nice, satisfying thunkiness to it and travels well with a good response. Another thing I wanted to take a look at here was the keying of the face buttons in case someone wanted to swap the configuration of the face buttons from a Nintendo BAYX style to an Xbox ABXY style. The only face button uniquely keyed is the Y button, which means that if we were to swap the position of the X and Y, we would end up with a sideways Y because of the location of the keying on that button. This is a shame since we technically can't make that change without modification. And one last thing I wanted to show is that Powkiddy even went as far as putting felt material on the additional buttons like the power and reset. So enough of all of that, it's time to get into some gaming, and we're going to go with a different approach to the emulation showcase. First, I want to talk about the platforms and games that do work really well with this square aspect ratio. Then we will talk about emulation that is still possible, but not an exact fit, and then finally wrap it up with the less ideal scenarios. I think that it's probably obvious based on some of the hints I've dropped throughout the video just how much I am really enjoying using the RGB30 to play Game Boy, Gameboy Color, Geo Pocket, and PICO-8 games. Because of the aspect ratio for those platforms, the 1:1 screen here on the RGB30 really accommodates them quite well. I think I might have to go as far as saying that this is currently my favorite way to play these games. In terms of performance, the Rockchip RK3566 will have no issues with any of these. It's been an absolute treat to play through some of my favorites on Game Boy. It's also great to see that the device comes configured pretty well out of the box. I think I could spend an entire video just gushing and showing off original Game Boy on here, but that wouldn't be fair to some of the other platforms that work just as well here. When it comes to Game Boy Color, it's really much of the same, as this is a platform that scales incredibly well here, and with the beautiful display of the RGB30 really shows off some of the great enhancements that came with the Game Boy Color. I think anyone that loves Game Boy and Game Boy Color will absolutely be thrilled to enjoy the library of these handhelds on the RGB30 and potentially see these games in a whole new way. But we shouldn't forget about Sega and the Game Gear, which also utilized a fairly square aspect ratio for its display. Game Gear is an interesting handheld since a lot of the games it received were ports from the Sega Master System, and so ironically some games were not scaled properly for the handheld. Regardless, looking at Game Gear, and it's obvious that this is a much better experience than what most of us experienced in 1990 with the original hardware. And another handheld that utilized a fairly square display was the Neo Geo Pocket and Neo Geo Pocket Color, which did not have a backlit screen, and so it's another library that can be enjoyed in a different way here on the RGB30. If you have not experienced the Neo Geo Pocket library, I definitely recommend checking it out, as there are quite a few gems here, especially for fans of the SNK library. Some of my personal favorites have to be the Metal Slug games, but the Neo Geo Pocket also received some decent support from third parties like Sega. Of course, how could I forget about the legendary Watara Supervision, which out of all of these handhelds I've mentioned actually had a perfectly square 1:1 aspect ratio for its display. I think for most that have heard about this handheld will probably know it more for its crazy design, but like most platforms, still has things worth examining, and with the RGB30, it's not a bad way to check out a very obscure platform without chasing down old hardware. Finally, one of the coolest and probably for many best use cases with the RGB30 is its ability to play PICO-8 games, and if you're unaware, PICO-8 is a fantasy video game console that mimics the graphics and sound of older consoles from the 8-bit era. PICO-8 games are designed to run using a 128 by 128 pixels, and therefore is a great match to the RGB30's square display. PICO-8 is just a real treat to play on here, and again with that fantastic display just allows these games to shine. I've had a blast going through some of my favorites for the PICO-8 platform, but also it reignited my interest and I scoured the internet for new games to try out. If you are a fan of the PICO-8 and all that comes with it, I think that the RGB30 is worth it alone just as a way to play these games, and essentially turns this fantasy console into a reality with a great dedicated way to play these games. And as a bonus, I had to sneak this in here since it's another great use case for the RGB30, and for many longtime viewers know just how much I love my shmups, and in particular, at least for the RGB30, vertical shmups will display really well here, including a lot of arcade games that made use of a vertical display. You will get a larger and more usable image than you would on a 4:3 aspect ratio handheld. Now moving on to some other platforms that still work quite well. For example, a lot of the 5th generation and earlier, so consoles like the PlayStation 1 for example, will still play really well on the RGB30. Despite the 1:1 aspect ratio display, 4:3 content will still provide a reasonably sized image that is equivalent to many other dedicated handhelds that would play these platforms. You can see how even on this 4-inch 1:1 screen that we are still getting almost a 3.5-inch 4:3 image, and so while at first glance this square display might come off as being strange, it actually is a fairly decent compromise for playing majority of the platforms that would work well with the RK3566. Now when it comes to Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, much of their respective libraries will be enjoyable on here. Again, it's really nice to see that emulators are configured properly out of the box, and loading up harder to run games like Dead or Alive 2 on Sega Dreamcast ran as I expected with the RK3566. Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 are not perfect here of course, but again, a lot of the library will run quite well. For PlayStation 1 and earlier, the RGB30 will have no issues running all of those older consoles. Finally, the last platforms I wanted to touch upon, with the RK3566, we definitely have a little more power under the hood to push the boundaries of what is possible with emulation. This is not the first RK3566 device I have covered on the channel, but in terms of what the limit is, I'd say that PSP is as far as you'd realistically expect to go. However, this is still not going to be anywhere near perfect, and really PSP is not a platform I'd consider on a device like this since PSP games were designed with a widescreen 16:9 display in mind and therefore does not look that great when displayed on a 1:1 aspect ratio panel. Now I always like to show what is possible, and also I want to show how PSP looks here on the RGB30. But again, it's just not something I'd consider to be your use case when considering something like the RGB30. And one last handheld that does emulate well in the RGB30, but again isn't an ideal use case for this device. Gameboy Advance is another handheld that had a bit of a wider aspect ratio, and therefore we are really not utilizing much of that 4-inch 1:1 aspect ratio display. And while it does emulate quite well here, it's not a platform I'd consider to play here on the RGB30 because of how much we lose in that image. Regardless, in a pinch, it's still something that is possible on the RGB30 and therefore worth mentioning. And of course, after all of this gaming, we're left wondering what battery life is like with the RGB30 and what we can expect from that 4100 mAh battery. So naturally for me, since this is predominantly going to be used as a Game Boy device, I wanted to start out with a Game Boy game, and for the first time ever, I am not actually going to be using Yoshi's Island for Super Nintendo. Instead, I will let the fantastic Game Boy game Trip World make an appearance here, and you also might have noticed a visit from my original Game Boy, and I thought it would be fun to have it on and running while I conducted my battery test. The Game Boy does have a fresh set of AA batteries ready to go for this, and to be honest, I didn't expect the RGB30 to win out here, but it did manage about 8 hours and 15 minutes running at 50% brightness and volume. There is a reason why the Game Boy dominated the handheld market, since it really does sip on those batteries and lasts what feels like forever. Now for another battery test, and one that I thought would be interesting. Game Gear is another great use case for the RGB30, and with the same conditions of 50% brightness and 50% volume, the RGB30 came in at under 7 hours. However, my modded Game Gear is still going strong with its fresh set of 6 AA batteries. I guess it shows you what a difference 2023 tech can make for the Game Gear, which back in 1990 was not known for its great battery life. Finally, one last battery test with the PICO-8, since this is another very strong area and use case for the RGB30, and once again with 50% brightness and volume, the RGB30 came in at 9 hours. And while we are at it, let's quickly check the temperatures here after the RGB30 has been on for some time playing a bit more demanding platforms. The RGB30 never felt hot to handle, and temperatures never exceeded 42 degrees Celsius, and this was at one area directly on the display, which is an area that will not be touched. On the sides of the device where your hands rest, the temperatures definitely drop by a few degrees. On the back, even on the area where the CPU is located, I didn't record any temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius, and as we moved away from the center, temperatures dropped as well. Again, the device never really felt noticeably hot to handle. There's no doubt that when we look at a device like the RGB30, it's a niche within a niche, but surprisingly, it's filling a niche really well. The reality is that original hardware, modded hardware, and even other retro handheld devices at similar price points will still not fill the use case that the RGB30 can, and also at its reasonable price point. The RGB30 also comes configured really well out of the box, and it has been the best experience out of the box that I've had with both JELOS and a Powkiddy product. This is exactly the direction that I want to continue to see Powkiddy move in. Again, being able to experience Game Boy games on here is something special, and the reality is that most will not want to play these games on original hardware. And even if you are very much someone who enjoys the Game Boy like I do, buying modded hardware can also be expensive. You can see just how great the experience of playing Game Boy on the RGB30 is, and really I feel like this is now one of the definitive ways to enjoy not only Game Boy, but Game Boy Color, Game Gear, PICO-8, and you know what, even some Watara Supervision. There are definitely devices at this price point that will accommodate more platforms in terms of its display, but the scaling that we can get here and with that crispy 720 by 720 resolution really makes this stand out to me, and if we approach the RGB30 as a dedicated device for the platforms I've mentioned earlier, I still think it's a great value as the alternatives can be more expensive, especially if you're looking for ways to play these games that have a more square aspect ratio. So I think it's time to wrap up here, and honestly I was pleasantly surprised by the RGB30. I didn't expect to like it as much as I did, and for me this is now my go-to device for enjoying Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Neo Geo Pocket, Game Gear, and especially PICO-8. I think the RGB30 is priced fairly, fills an interesting use case, and for many will have a great experience out of the box. Now it's not perfect, but I do think that this is one of the best experiences I've had with a Powkiddy product out of the box, and in the end, I've enjoyed my time with the RGB30 and will continue to do so. This is definitely a handheld that will stay in the rotation for me. I'm curious to hear what everyone thinks in the comments section about this interesting handheld, and do you have handhelds that you use for specific or dedicated scenarios? As always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.